All right, everybody, good to see all of you. Welcome to the latest installment in the Clements Center's ongoing spring semester speaker series. It's my pleasure to introduce my longtime, very dear friend, Professor Nicole Bibbins Sedaca of Georgetown University. Nicole and I actually first got to know each other many years ago at the State Department. I won't even say how many years ago it was, but
4.
Yeah, that's right. We were both 4 at the time. So. And we went through many bureaucratic battles with obstinate regional bureaus and other folks who were being typical State Department bureaucrats. So those kind of things either drive you crazy or forge deep friendships and a lot of trust. So she's anyway a very experienced policymaker with over a decade of work in a number of key issues at the State Department. Counterterrorism, trafficking in persons, women's empowerment, especially democracy and human rights, and so she'll be talking about that today. But also a very accomplished and inspirational teacher at Georgetown and mentor. And then I think it's safe to say a concerned citizen, chairwoman of the board of the International Justice Mission, really one of the most effective NGOs around, a number of things. So please join me in a warm welcome to Nicole Bibbins Sedaca.
Thank you for having me here today. It's just a really great pleasure. When Will invited me to speak, it took me, I think, about a half a second to make the decision because I thought I have such a high respect for the Clements Center, such a high respect for him as a colleague and a scholar, and Austin has been a town that's been on the top of my list for a long time as the foodie music capital, so it wasn't hard to get me to be here. Now, just a tip for those of you in public speaking, if someone asks you, make sure that you don't ever accept if there's a highly contentious election in your own country, in Turkey, in the UK, and in France, and an unraveling of the global system right before you talk. It just makes it a little bit harder. But Austin is still a great town, Will is still a great friend, and the Clements Center is still doing just tremendous work in educating and shaping tomorrow's leaders. So I'm delighted to be here today. I think I've been trying to lure Will back to Washington for many years, but now that I'm here, it just may have the opposite effect. So if you have one more citizen as of Saturday, then you'll know why. So my topic for today is democracy and human rights and its role within U.S. foreign policy. I've spent the better part of 2 decades looking at this issue, working with people like Will, to advance that issue as part of U.S. foreign policy, both from the governmental side, the non-governmental side, and an academic perch. The issue today is not an easy one, but it's vitally important, I will argue, to the security and the prosperity of the United States and indeed the entire global system, and to the United States' moral voice in this process. To start our discussion, I want to do something which we in Washington don't ever do, which is step out of the current debate, today's administration, today's argument, today's bickering, whatever it is to step out of that current debate and take a strategic perspective of what this issue means. To ask the strategic question, does this have a place in American foreign policy in order that we have strategy followed by tactics and policy, as opposed to tactics and policy that eventually accumulate into a strategy or a decision? Let me first start with a quick story about how I was exposed to this question of governance. And I'm glad to see people of a wide variety of ages because I think that will bring a lot of texture to our conversation because I think we've all experienced and thought about this issue from a lot of different historical standpoints. I am German American, and my mother, when I was 18, decided to send me to Auntie, which is what most moms do at some point. I'm a parent now and I understand what it means to park your child somewhere. So I was sent, I was 18 years old. It was 1989. Please don't do the math, but you know 1989 was a crucial year for Berlin. It was the year in October that the wall came down. I was there in August visiting my aunt. And so she, as a German citizen, says to me, as an American citizen, do you want to just go across the border for a day? You're 18, what do you know? So I said, absolutely. She couldn't go because for a German citizen at that point to do it, you had to sign all kinds of papers and get all kinds of permission, and I walked across the border. It took me about an hour to get through the checkpoint, but I eventually entered in. I left West Berlin, which at that point was, and it still is today, a vibrant, bustling, beautiful,
full city with tremendous commerce, diversity, and I entered into a town, despite the beautiful historic buildings, that was gray, that was militarized, where you could see police on every corner, that even as a person who doesn't look like your average East German, people were afraid to even look because you didn't have the confidence in that society to look at that odd person walking down the street. There was a feeling of a blanket of oppression that you could palpably feel. And as an 18-year-old, it made me ask the question, how does one city with similar people, same culture, same language, in many cases the same families, two sides of a wall, have such different experiences? Have such different experiences in their economic development, have such different experiences in their ability to express their voice, to worship, to move freely in their society, to see life for their children getting better, and contribute to the stability of the international system. And the answer for me, I probably as an 18-year-old didn't quite articulate it, but was a difference in a choice of a governing system. It was a difference in a choice of one side where the world had stood with West Berlin to maintain it as a democratic island in this country, and the other side that was not. And that started a process in my brain, which I still hold today, which is governance matters. And it matters to security, it matters to economic development, and it matters to the life of individual people today. So democracy has been a governing system for many, many years, and it spread rapidly through the world with significant growth periods in the 70s and the 90s and steadily ever since. Let me just show this. This is a graph from Freedom House, published in The Economist recently, and it will show from 1972 until now the progress of democracy in the world. The darker the country, the more democratic, the lighter ones are less democratic. It will just show, if I can do it with my technological, of course I messed it up already. Let me see if I can get this back here. It will just show, nope, I didn't do it, hold on. It will just show, if I can do this, sorry. There we go, let's see if we can get back to there. There we go. How this democratic system has grown in the world since 1972, and you'll see the increase of darkening countries as time has gone over the past several decades. There has been regression, there has been progress, but you see that the map has been darkening over time, which tells us that parts of the world where we thought democracy was not possible or that growth was not possible, we have seen tremendous growth over time. But that trend is slowing. There is no doubt that that trend is slowing. Freedom House, which is the organization that put this together, has also shown us the freedom in the balance, which shows these green countries are free countries, these are partly free, these are not free, and this is from 1986 to 2016. We have seen a steady increase in democratic countries, but in this last decade, we have seen fewer free countries over time. So this trend is slowing, and there has been some deterioration. Just to give you the context of what we're talking about. According to Freedom House, there are only a handful more electoral democracies in the world today than there were at the start of the century. And when we see this graph, we see that there has been a decline. Part of this decline is that there were easy states that were heading in the democratic direction, and they democratized relatively quickly and sort of were left with the tougher cases now. Some of it is due to the significant challenges that we see in the world today. Authoritarianism, populism, and a lot of other isms, terrorism, the growth of non-state criminal and terrorist groups that are posing threats on weak democracies and countries that are aspiring to democracies. But the story is actually not as bleak as some would paint. According to a recent article written by democracy scholar Tom Carruthers, statistics actually paint a slightly different picture. While we have seen regression, the popular support and interest in democracy remains steady and is increasing. The Afrobarometer, which measures the whole number of different statistics within the African context, has said that over 70% of Africans support democracy. The World Values Survey showed that the support for democracy in the Middle East, despite the failures of the Arab Spring, is actually on a slow, steady increase. Anecdotally, we see protests around the world, and they're almost exclusively for democracy. There are not people going to the streets in Gambia or in Korea asking for more dictatorship. They are going to the streets to ask that their democracies be more accountable and be stronger. And in fact, in the Gambia, as we saw, a courageous effort of the people to go to ask the dictator who was unelected or elected out of office to leave, at a regional organization, ECOWAS, standing up for a democratic transition in the country. And these are all signs that there is still steady and strong support for this concept. So while there are significant challenges to democracy and a slowing pace of democracy, there is this support, which then brings us to the question, what should the United States' role be vis-a-vis democracy and human rights in the world? I speak to graduate students on a regular basis. That's my job right now. And when I speak to them, I often sense concern and skepticism about democracy promotion and how it relates to foreign policy. I suspect and know that much of that is related to the Iraq War, and I'd be happy to unpack that as we get into our question and answer. But what I want to do right now is make the argument that democracy promotion is smart policy for the United States government, that it is the right and moral choice for the US government, and it is also a responsibility for the United States government. Before I do that, let me just define a few terms. When I'm speaking of government, when I'm speaking of democracy, I'm speaking of a complete picture that includes democratic governing system, a vibrant civil society, and liberal societal values. That governing system includes democratic institutions, checks and balances, free and fair elections, independent judiciary, constitutional rights, and it's based on the rule of law, majority rule, and minority rights. And it functions alongside of a vibrant civil society that includes free media, strong and engaged non-governmental participation, and an educated and engaged citizenry. It's a high bar, but that is the goal of what we're talking about as of democracy. You'll hear me reference democracy and human rights as partner issues. When I speak of the protection of human rights, I'm referring primarily to political and civil rights, but also the economic and social rights, but those that are codified in the UN Declaration for Human Rights. These include the right to worship, assembly, freedom of speech, the rights to be free of torture, arbitrary detention, and many other rights. And the reason I talk about these two together is that they are intrinsically linked. Human rights are unquestionably best protected in those countries that are based on the respect for human rights, that have a functioning legal system that actively protects them, and a government that's committed to protecting them. So simply put, human rights are best protected within a democracy. So let's unpack this issue and look at why is it that it is a smart choice, the right moral choice, and a responsibility for the United States. Promoting democracy, I would argue, is a smart policy choice for the United States in its foreign policy decision-making. The US government is charged primarily with advancing and representing the interests of the American people. It's not a human rights NGO, it's not a democracy NGO. It is singularly responsible for promoting and advancing policies that are within the direct interest of its citizens. And I would argue that it directly impacts US security, economic, and systemic interests. So first, in the security field, democracies, it is in the United States' interest to see more democracies in the world, because we know, not only from the democratic peace theory from many centuries ago, but also in what we bear out in seeing in relations in today, that the United States has more peaceful relations with democracies, and that where we see the threats to the international system, they emanate from places that are either ungoverned or governed by authoritarian regimes. Democracies are more likely than non-democracies to follow international legal principles and norms and not to threaten other countries around them. They're more likely to be accountable to their citizens and therefore less likely to use military force against other nations without some accountability at home. They're more likely to practice resolving conflicts among divergent political actors at home, which they extend into the international scene. Democracies resolve differences through negotiations and compromise and skills that they bring to the international level. Democracies are less likely to proliferate or misuse nuclear weapons. And it is not a surprise that the primary security threats that the United States and the international system face today, North Korea, Iran, terrorist groups that flourish in ungoverned territories, take place in places without democratic governance. Now, this is not a guarantee that democracies will be perfect partners, or that you cannot cooperate with an authoritarian regime, or that if there were democracies, every single threat would be dissipated. But rather it is to make the argument that the global community would be more stable and would be more secure if there were a predominance of democracies than if there were a predominance of non-democracies. So let me move to economic development. One objective of the United States government, obviously, is also to protect American economic interests abroad for the sake of American prosperity at home. And once again, the United States looks around, and our strongest partners for our own economic development remains those countries which are democracies. They are more reliable, stable trading partners. They follow international trade and financial norms. They have lower levels of corruption, and they generally exercise the rule of law, which allows for more transparent and open and economic engagement. Third point as to why it's smart policy. The United States, as it looks around the world, has benefited from this liberal world order that everybody's talking about. This system that was put in place after the Second World War through the Bretton Woods institutions and through the proliferation of norms and platforms that have allowed us to build economic interdependence, have allowed us to build platforms for international negotiation and resolution of conflict through productive means. The United States has been able to project and advance its own economic and security needs through that system. And that system has been advanced and has been strengthened by the existence of democracies in the system. Has also been supported at times from a number of different non-democratic countries. But the fact that the values upon which this system has been based are democratic values, it is those democracies that have shared in that have contributed to that system from which the United States benefits. And as we look around the world, we now see most of the regional organizations, ASEAN, the Organization for American States, the African Union, the European Union, all now having within their charters an explicit reference to democracy or democracy promotion as a component of what their mandate is, which means the international system has embraced that system which has benefited the United States as their own regional goals. So there's the argument for smart policy. Let me give a couple caveats before I move on to why I actually think it's just a right and moral choice. I recognize that these arguments about security and economics and the global system are not without counterfactuals. Democratization is a long and non-linear process, and it is fraught in the short and medium term with economic and sometimes security challenges. There is no question about that. We see places where there is democratic regression and where there have been difficulties economically or in security areas. It's not easy, but the alternative of authoritarian regimes over the long term and the benefits of democracy over the long term remain facts despite the short-term challenges. Second issue is democracy promotion. I recognize is not the only U.S. foreign policy objective. It would be nice in my book if it were. But I recognize that there are a lot of different foreign policy objectives and that we cannot as a country constantly put democracy promotion as our singular goal, but that it does at times have to be balanced with other goals. That's a natural part. But the question that we have on the table is, should it remain as a cornerstone and a pillar of foreign policy in the United States? And I would argue it should. It does remind me of the quote that many have heard from Winston Churchill, which he gave in a speech in November 1947, that democracy is actually just the worst form of government, except for all the other ones that have been tried from time to time. And I would agree with that. I may not be as cynical as he was, but democracy has shortcomings. There's no doubt. We see that here, we see that around the world. But the question is there a better option for American interests and for American foreign policy? So there's the argument about smart policy. Is it in the United States' interest? Let's move to this question of, is it the right thing to do? I would argue, we know that Democracy is the system that best protects human rights. It gives citizens a say in their laws and policies that impact their life, and it gives them the opportunity to provide some stability and security. We know that genocides don't happen in democracy. We know that massive human rights abuses don't occur in democracies. We know that refugees are not produced in democracies. We know that economic mismanagement that we have seen behind famine and other significant humanitarian crises do not happen in democracies. And so for that reason, for the moral benefit of the people who live better under democratic regimes, I would argue that the United States has a moral obligation to stand for the same democratic system that we have worked very hard at home to promote, because of the benefit that it brings other people, almost regardless of these other issues. There was an interesting talk recently by British parliamentarian Rory Stewart in which he talked about how do we balance our interests and the right thing to do. He used the example of torture, and he said, if we think about whether a country should use torture as a tool of foreign policy, and someone says, well, I don't think we should do it because it doesn't give us effective intelligence. That just means it's not in our interest to do that. But what if we said, oh, it provides great intelligence? Does that make it the right thing to do? I would argue it doesn't. I would argue that at some point we have to come down and say it is simply the right thing to do regardless of the benefits it may provide. And that in the case of the United States, even though there is a strong argument about why it is in the United States' interest, the fact that it is just the right thing to do should also compel us to make this a cornerstone of our foreign policy. Finally, we have our smart choice, the moral right choice, and American responsibility. For better or for worse, and we can debate whether it's better or worse, the United States is in a leadership position, and it has been in that position for decades. Which means the United States' action, the United States' voice matter on the international scene, and how the United States responds is seen by both democracies and authoritarian governments. I can't count how many meetings I have been in, and I'm sure that Will was in many of them, where we were sitting across the table from leaders and officials from other governments, European governments, Latin American, African governments, when we say, how will you respond to this? And they looked and they said, we will follow America's lead. We will follow America's lead, which tells me that countries are looking to the United States. Whether we should be in that position or not, we can debate, but countries look to the United States to calibrate how they will respond to international situations. So if the United States is silent, or the United States speaks up for or against, the world counts the United States as a leader, and that matters. And here I would say not reacting is a policy choice. Okay, often we think of it as neutral. We in the United States don't have the neutrality option. Not reacting is a policy choice, and it sends as much of a signal as speaking out for or against something. So that is the argument for it being a smart policy, a moral, the right moral choice, and something which is the United States' responsibility. Let me just talk about the how, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the counter arguments, which I expect. The how is a difficult question. How do you promote democracy? There's no easy answer, and there's no singular answer, and there's no universal answer that works in all cases. But the United States has a myriad of tools that it can use to promote democracy and also protect human rights. First, our voice. Our voice matters in the international system. How we respond to human rights abuses, how we respond to shortcomings in democratic processes or people going to the street, it matters. Those conversations can happen behind closed doors. Those conversations can happen publicly. It can happen across the table. But how we have those conversations and with whom we have those conversations matter. Will we have those conversations with leaders or with people on the street? Will we have them with people who represent entire countries or movements, or will we have them simply with people who sit in state houses? All of those questions matter. Secondly, support for activists. We have the opportunity and I would argue the responsibility to provide financial, rhetorical, and technical support for activists and democratically oriented civil society members around the world. Technical assistance. We have the ability, either directly or through non-governmental organizations or international organizations, to provide technical assistance that strengthens government's ability to govern democratically. We have a whole range of coercive tools at our disposal: economic sanctions, diplomatic exclusion, public rebuke, that help to compel changes in behavior. The United States remains an actor that is shaping international norms and international legal standards, and this too can be used for promoting democratic governance and norms. But finally, we have a lot of tools outside of the US government. American citizens, American organizations, American corporations are around the world, shaping how America's face is seen around the world, and that is a strong and compelling tool for the United States to see as a tool around the world. But let me also make clear, as we're talking about the how, or thinking about the how, it is not simply a question of the United States doing this alone. I will never argue that this is singularly the United States' job. This is a multilateral job. And it's a place where sometimes the United States will be out front, sometimes the United States will be in the back. Sometimes the United States will be alongside a number of countries, and sometimes the United States will stand alone. And it's important to look at it as a multifaceted way of approaching it. It's not easy, and it's not a guarantee that we'll have Jeffersonian democracy within 30 days or less, but it is a question of whether this is important enough that we will put it on the American foreign policy agenda as a long-term policy goal for the United States to be committed to. Before I close, let me just think and pose back to you a few of the counter-arguments that I expect, which, if you're not clear, that's the way a person talking about democracy can squelch democratic discussion by talking about it. Here's what I would expect are some counter-arguments, or some counter-arguments that students have posed back to me. Democracy promotion can't be done at the barrel of a gun. Yep, 100% right. I'm not going to argue that one, unquestionably. Democracy can't be imposed. Again, absolutely correct. And nothing that I said or would ever advocate that the United States or any other organization would be in a position of imposing a democratic system, one which basically is about empowering people from the grassroots up. It's arrogant to promote democracy. Who would the United States or any other country be to go around the world and promote democracy? I would argue, as individuals and as nations, we are faced with an opportunity to speak out in the face of justice. In fact, I just took a picture, what is in your lobby here, great words from our great president, President Johnson. Our mission is at once the oldest and the most basic of this country: to right wrong, to do justice, and to serve man. So, if you want to argue with me, you can argue first with President Johnson, I guess. But
argue with your own diploma.
Right. If it is arrogant to speak out against justice, if it's arrogant to speak out about those things which are codified in the UN Declaration for Human Rights, not necessarily just in what the United States documents are, then I'm not sure upon what our basis is for speaking publicly. These are principles and ideas that, yes, certainly have grown out of an American tradition, but they have been codified globally and regionally. So speaking out on them is merely pointing to the documents that most countries themselves have ascribed to. Democracy promotion is just too hard. It's hard. It's really hard. But truthfully, important things that are worth fighting for and are hard are still worth fighting for. And if it is important to American interests, and it's important to providing the same opportunities that we have understand and live each day, then it is important to continue to work hard for them. Last, and I'll just throw this in really quickly, what if an American administration doesn't agree with this? I'll just figure out how I can talk through that one quickly. This doesn't change the rightness of the objective. And that's why I asked us to step out of the current debate and think about, is this a strategic priority? Is this something that our country should stand for Because administrations will come and go, policies will come and go, policymakers will come and go. But my question is, particularly for those of you who I expect will be leading for the next 30, 40, 50 years, is this important enough for America's interests and important enough for America's moral voice that it should be a component of our foreign policy? And if so, then we need to look at all of the levers to bring that to bear. A quick example before I close. I mentioned at the beginning my opportunity to step into a country cloaked in authoritarian government when I was 18. 20-some years later, I had the opportunity to again walk into a country for several days that once again was divided. I had the opportunity when we were at the State Department to go to North Korea for a 3-day negotiation with the government. We had spent about a week in South Korea before. Again, same people, same language, same culture, same history, but two people, two countries divided. And the difference is staggering. A country where you step into the country and you can feel the cloak of oppression. And again, when you're a 6-foot-tall African-American, you walk into a country like North Korea and no one will stare at you, you know you are in a place where it is oppressive, because I was about the strangest thing that I'm sure has walked into their country. But there was such a cloak of oppression that no one was willing to engage you on the street. No one was willing to look at you in the eye. Every corner has a military person, and there were 2 that followed me my entire time when I walked around. We then went back to South Korea, beautiful, vibrant, wonderful country that is a security partner, that is an economic partner, and is a thriving, contributing member of the international community. Same people, same history, same human capacity, but divided by a choice in government. I'll leave you with this quote from Franklin Roosevelt. I guess it's all my World War II quotes today, from his 3rd inaugural address, 1941. The democratic aspiration is no mere recent phase in human history. It is human history. So if we believe that statement from President Roosevelt, the question that is in front of us is, what is our part? What is the part of the US government in that aspiration and the unfolding of human history? So with that, I look forward to our conversation.